Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you for coming on a Friday morning. I know you probably have a lot to do on your Friday before the weekend, so I appreciate you coming and learning a little bit. Hopefully, there'll be some learning that you get from this. Again, my name is Andy Noon, and I am the founder, principal consultant for Decatur Street Consulting. And today's topic is something I'm super passionate about. It's how do you really think about your assessment strategy when it comes to your succession planning efforts? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means to me and kind of hopefully some things that you can take away for yourself and your organization. Before we get started on the content, I'd love to, since we're talking about assessments, I'd really have a real interest in knowing where do you stand with assessments and what's your current level of understanding. So if you have your phone, if you have the capability to scan the QR code, and just give me your sense of where you are. Are you a beginner, immediate expert? Do you like what are assessments? I don't even understand quite what the concept is. It would be helpful to kind of get a sense of that. Awesome. We have an expert. Awesome. We have beginners. Looks like we've kind of hit the majority of them. So we have some experts here. So I'm excited to actually engage a little bit in terms of others' perspectives. And then I just ask, same use the QR code. And did your organization currently use assessments? If so, what do you use? Do you have a very specific one, a personality tool? Do you use 360s? What kind of assessments do you actually use? Give it a little extra time. I'm sure you have to type it out. Egan Zender. We'll be using the Hogans. Go talk a little bit about Hogans. Use DISC 360s. Awesome. Anything else? All right, so I think you've kind of hit some key things. Obviously, there's some personality inventories that are very prominent. We use 360s as part of the process, probably more for the development side. And so it's good to just kind of have a sense of what that looks like. When we talk about this today, I'll try and bring in both perspectives about different types of tools that are things that you need to do. Those of you that don't know me, again, my name is Andy Noon, principal consultant and founder of Decatur Street Consulting. And just a little bit about my background. I have a PhD in industrial psychology, certified executive coach. I teach, I'm an adjunct professor of leadership at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Have been in the talent management space throughout my career. So been in a lot of different industries, big companies, small companies, running talent management's kind of been what I've done throughout my career. And for the last 25 years, I've been designing talent programs, culture efforts, employee engagement, leadership development, have just been kind of things that I've done throughout my career. And so today I really want to talk about assessments. And as I was thinking through kind of a webinar I wanted to do today, I think what we're seeing in the industry when it comes to succession planning is a focus on, hey, we need to do this. We know there's a lot of baby boomers that are going to be leaving organizations. We have, if you're in some industries, you have a lot of CEOs that are leaving your organizations. And so that trickles down throughout the organization. And the question is really about how do we make sure we are as accurate as possible? We have to hire the right individual for those roles. And there's some challenges with a lot of our current succession planning processes that make that difficult. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And then I want to talk about, I think assessments are the right solution to many of those challenges. And so I want to talk about how assessments fit into succession planning. And then I'll end with a case study. And it's not overly complicated, but I think it shows the directionally why assessments are important. We're a relatively small group today, so if you have questions, just take yourself off of mute and just ask me. I think we can make this as much a dialogue as possible. And so obviously I want to make sure there's time at the end, let you ask any questions that you have, but let's make it maybe more of a dialogue to begin where we're going today. So the first thing I want to make sure is just a quick disclaimer. This is meant for educational purposes only, and it isn't really about any legal advice. The reason I want to make sure to say that is because assessment, if you really think about what succession is, it's a selection process. And so obviously when you're dealing with selection, you want to make it's a process that falls under the uniform guidelines. And so if you have questions or you're thinking about using assessments, I highly encourage you to talk to your HR team, your legal department, whoever would be the right person to help frame the direction that you want to take. So with that, I'm going to move into what we're going to talk about today. So when it comes to succession, there are a lot of challenges that are relevant. And it really has to do with the fact that succession is an evaluation. It's a judgment of how you see a person's potential. And so when you talk about something like that in an evaluation process, potential is kind of nebulous. It tends to have a pretty subjective evaluation and a subjective definition. So it requires a leader to make some interpretation, which can get in the way of ensuring that you're having feedback and definitions that are aligned with each other across people. You're asking an individual to predict the future. So that's a hard thing to do, and especially if you're not clear on what that future, in terms of how to define it, what that looks like. We know from the research that typically evaluations of potential are overemphasize current performance. And I'll talk a little bit about that, where actually what we know is that current performance is not a strong predictor of future success in a different role. And so you need different ways in which to assess those capabilities. We know that there's a lot as it relates to ineffective leadership development. In fact, I just published an article the other day where the majority of our leadership development is about training, and that only 5 to 20% of training is actually goes into what people do in the future. So there's some different things that we can do to help enhance our development processes. And then, we still know that 60% of leaders who have been promoted will not be successful in their first 18 months. And so that succession rate is still not where it needs to be. And part of that, I think, is how we are determining who the right individuals are that move into next level roles. So I just want to kind of make sure to hit a few of these challenges, right? So if you're talking about you're rating somebody as it relates to their level of potential, it falls through the same path of any other rating process. It still has certain biases. We know this from performance ratings. There's lots of biases that go into those evaluations. Everything from similar to me bias in terms of, hey, if people look and act like me, because I've been successful, I assume they're also successful. So a lot of times you have similar to me bias when it comes to succession planning, because again, if the person who's evaluating their direct reports has already been successful and been put into a higher level role, and they look like that the person they're evaluating has a lot of those characteristics, they make the assumption that they're also going to be successful. But you have all kinds of other things, from opportunity bias. That's the idea when certain people have certain jobs that maybe make it easier for them to be successful. So, like for example, if you have an individual who's in a region that is just exploding because of something outside of the control of the leader, they're going to look really, really positive. Comparing people to others in terms of contrast bias is another one. Halo and horn bias, the idea that when somebody has this great characteristic, you evaluate all of their characteristics as being positive, or if it's a negative characteristic, you evaluate all of their capabilities as being negative. Confirmation bias is, hey, when you have something you're looking for, you tend to find things that support it. And then recency bias is the idea that when you're evaluating somebody from a succession standpoint, you're tending to look at things very recently and giving it a higher level of impact on your evaluation. So these are things that happen in every evaluation or rating process. And there's definitely things that you can do to overcome that. And I think assessments are a way to be very thoughtful about that. The other is three things that are really super specific to succession planning that are biases of profile. And you'll probably see some of the things here that I was just had on the previous screen. Like mini-me bias is very similar to similar as me bias. It's the idea that, hey, you're looking at somebody who looks just like you, but at a younger level, the person that is up and coming, that just has a lot of the similar characteristics as you, and thus you see great potential in them, but the problem is the manager doesn't necessarily see the deficiencies, probably because they don't see the deficiencies in themselves. And it really underpins an issue of you start getting a lot of people that look the same being identified as potential successors. There's also the Old Faithful profile. This is the profile where you have the longtime employee, the person who's loyal to the institution, and really is the person that is with deep knowledge and capability in the institution. Doesn't necessarily have the leadership skills, but are rated highly in having potential because we're going to support them and give them extra capability or extra opportunities, almost to reward them for their loyalty. And the last one is what I call the technical guru. It's the one that they have these skill sets that are everybody looks at and says, wow, that's really, maybe it's the AI in today's world. And they can deal with technical issues and they have insights that other people don't have. And thus they evaluate that as being, oh, well, they must have great potential because of this intellect and knowledge that helps them. But they lack the leadership, business acumen, and a number of interpersonal characteristics that are going to certainly get in the way of them being successful. And I just end this kind of challenges as it relates to succession with this last one, which is this idea that performance is not potential. And so there's a research this is actually relatively dated at this point, but I think the point is the right one. And I would say, having done this for so many years, I'd say it still holds. And it's this idea that high performers are not always high potentials. That is, hey, you can have some of those individuals that were just on the last page, the technical guru, great performer in their role as they are currently. But that doesn't necessarily equate to whether or not they have the potential to be a leader at the next level. And so here you see that in terms of the pie. 29% of high performers are high potentials. So it is important for you. Very rarely will you have a high potential that's not a high performer. And, but on the other hand, high performers don't necessarily have to be high potentials. On the other hand, high potentials are almost always high performers. It's almost like a gate to get into the discussion. So you have to be a high performer, but that doesn't necessarily, in the previous part of that, doesn't mean that you're a high potential. But you have to be a high performer. In order to be a high potential, being a high performer is kind of the key thing. So with those kind of challenges sitting in front of us, the question is, how can we do a better job of assessing potential and being able to differentiate performance and potential to lead to the right types of decisions? So I want to talk about assessments and what role assessments can play in our succession planning process. So for those of you that, and I know there was at least one of you that is a beginner when it comes to assessments, if you take it to its kind of core aspect, an assessment is just a structured and objective method of gathering information about an individual's skills, capabilities, cognitive abilities, whatever it might be that's important to be successful in the role. And it tends to be things that are truly aligned to role success and can be used to make decisions. So there's some important pieces in there that I'm going to talk about as we move forward. And one is this idea of it needs to be structured, right? Everybody has to be going through the same thing so that you can make comparisons, that you can do some statistical analysis to make sure that there's alignment to the job. If you're not doing that, and if it's very haphazard, then you can't make comparisons, which is kind of the goal of succession, right? It's the idea of, I want to be able to compare individuals on similarly situated characteristics so I can determine if there's somebody who's going to be more successful in the role. And that's, as we begin to talk about that, I will make that a little bit clearer as we go. So when it comes to assessments, there's a lot of thought process on this, and I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint what I think is really valuable in a succession planning thought process is this idea of objectivity. So objectivity just refers to the idea of impartiality, unbiased, and is not influenced by a person's feelings or opinions. So it's something that takes it outside of the judgment of the manager or whoever's making those judgments. As I talked about this idea of, so what's the opportunity here? The opportunity is you do get better comparison. You're able to compare across different leaders on things that don't have the biases in them that you had in what we talked about in terms of evaluations. It removes those biases, and it's generally a better predictor of performance. So again, if we go back to the idea that succession planning is making sure that you're able to make the best possible decision, then you want to be using the tools that enable you to make those best possible decisions. And assessments help to bring that to the forefront. So when you look across some things that you potentially use as it relates to succession, you have everything that's from very completely subjective to what I'd call semi-objective, and then you have the last thing, which is completely objective for the most part. So if you look at some subjective things that I think probably any of you that are doing succession planning have probably used as in your process. So it's things like manager ratings, could be performance reviews. I'm guessing all of us do some thought around, bring some thought in about what's the person's individual's previous performance. And then we all do potential evaluations, right? So what's their level of potential? Are they high potential, moderate potential, low potential? And I'm going to show you in a slide coming up that that is as subjective as it potentially gets. Then you have some things that you're probably maybe bringing into your process that starts to get a little bit more objective. So things like structured nominations for, potential leadership programs or something else that you're doing as part of the process, where every manager is using the same criteria, every manager is using the same thought process as it relates to those nominations. Talent review consensus meetings. So see how what I'm not saying, the consensus meeting enables there to it's starting to be a different level of objectivity, because then you can ensure that the managers are talking through what is the way in which everybody's are assessing those characteristics. Just the manager assessment is super subjective. When you start to have consensus parts of that, it starts to bring in some more objectivity. Structured 360s, the structured aspect of this, and then also the ability to put a report together that summarizes it. It starts to get to be a little bit more objective, but it certainly has some subjective aspects to it. And then if you're doing some structured interview 360s, that starts to give some more objectivity as well. What I'm going to talk mostly about today are what I'd call true objective assessments. These are things like personality assessments. I know when we did the questions at the beginning, you talked about DISC and you talked about a couple of other ones, the Hogan. These are the kinds of things that are starting to become very objective in terms of the process. Cognitive ability assessments or critical thinking types of assessments are very helpful. Skills-based assessments, simulations, work samples, all they address some of the key things. They take away manager judgment. They are objective. They take away much of the subjective aspects. Excuse me. So let me start talking about how you could think about your own assessment strategy. So the first thing, I think it's important to see, where does assessments fit in the overall process? So this is a very typical kind of scaled down succession planning process. So what do we typically do? We want to make sure that we're clear about the success profile. The success profile can be something very specific for an individual job, or maybe it's a leadership model that you use that is something that is indicative of success in your organization from a leadership standpoint. And then you're going to go through assessing candidates. You can do that from the standpoint of whole pools of candidates or candidates for a very specific job. But somewhere we're going to do some assessment of potential candidates. Then based on that, you may be going down the path of those that are high potentials. How do we build their capabilities? And then once an opening comes up, we're going to have some type of transition process. And yours may look a little bit different, but generally, conceptually, this is a very typical way of doing succession planning. So the first part of this, what I think organizations are sometimes struggle with is really taking the step back and say, well, how are we defining potential? what does potential actually look like in our organization? And some organizations will do this really well, and others will maybe not do it as effectively as possible. And if you look at some, so they may have some very general definitions, like being in the top 10% of leaders. I've seen the ability to achieve 2 higher levels from their current role, ability to take a higher level role in the next 2 years. Others might be some generic ability, ambition, and agility. And I will tell you, I've even seen others that don't talk about potential at all, and it's just what's their level of performance. And these, if you kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, if you are asking a leader to really think about these things, they get to come up with exactly what their own definition of potential is. So, of course, my highest performing leader is my in the top 10%, because they're really good and they do some really valuable things. It gives the leader the opportunity to make whatever decision they want in terms of defining potential. So what we really have to do is take a step back and say, okay, if we're going to have ability to be objective and the ability to think more critically about who our future leaders in the organization should be, we need to really define what potential is. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what that should look like. I have my own perspective, but I think there's 2 directions you can go. One is to just define the leadership model that you want to use in your organization. So, the specific competencies, they should be aligned to what your organization's trying to accomplish. And they need to be detailed enough that a leader could read them and say, oh, okay, I can make a judgment around that, and I can think about that. And it also should hopefully be stretch. It should be like, hopefully a little bit of differentiation from, your mid-level leader to your senior leaders. Because if you're, again, only evaluating an individual for their current level of leadership, we're missing the point of succession. It's about thinking at the next highest level. The other way you can go about this is, and I'm starting to really take a more thoughtful approach around this, and that is defining what leadership potential should be. And we know there are some things that research has shown that actually are indicative of individuals that are able to be successful because they have the potential to grow and learn and have higher capabilities. And it's really about identifying leadership growth potential, not necessarily current leadership ability. So things that we know about this, like learning agility, growth mindset, tolerance for ambiguity, strong leader or analytical skills, strong people relationship capabilities. A lot of these things are also part of other leadership models, but it's really more about the individual's ability to be successful at the next level. So really a potential evaluation. So if, here's an example. This comes from a previous organization I worked at. I think we did a pretty good job with this. It's a leadership model that it was really about forming the language about what leadership meant in the organization. And it was as simple as 6 core characteristics. It wasn't 10, 20 things. It really became clear that these things were important to being successful in that specific organization as a leader. So once you've identified your profile, the next question is, how do you go about assessing candidates? And what I would tell you, the goal of assessments is not to eliminate the manager's judgment. The manager still has a very important role in the process. The assessment process is there to validate those manager evaluations. And so it just enables the process to move from being some really subjective to much less subjective and more able to have some clarity that the language that you've identified as being important for succession actually has the capabilities brought into it, because the assessments help us ensure that the manager evaluations are not based on some subjective judgments, but are based on actual evaluations of capability. And so when thinking about assessments, those ones that were objective that I talked about, there are things that you're going to want to be thoughtful about. And again, this is where you can bring in an industrial psychologist, or maybe there's somebody on your HR team that can help with this. But you're going to want to make sure, because these are helping you make decisions, they need to be valid and reliable. So they need to have strong psychometric properties, things that are out there that are really help with that capability from a standpoint of being able to defend the results that come out. They need to help you evaluate next level leader capabilities. So again, if you're only assessing frontline capabilities from a leadership standpoint, but you actually need somebody to start being more strategic, which is not something that's easily developed, you probably are going to want to start assessing that and being thoughtful about how to do that. You want it to be flexible. So the flexibility of tools to evaluate different capabilities. The cool thing about assessments is that you can actually use more than one tool. So for example, if you needed critical thinking skills and you needed strategic thinking skills, you could use a personality inventory in a critical thinking assessment and be able to assess multiple things as part of the process. And then consistent comparison across leaders. Again, we've talked about that value as part of this process. So how could that work in the aspect of succession planning? Well, you would still want the manager to go through your talent review process or whatever your evaluation process is. So, whatever the company has built from a succession or talent review, it provides certainly subjective evaluations, but I've found that over time, if you do this over multiple years, managers start to get it and they start to understand, and especially if you have good HR teams who are able to push them to think about leadership in a different way, it starts to become relatively accurate. And then it becomes your primary indicator of potential. Well, then you can bring the assessment process in. So you would want to use objective assessments that evaluate leadership or potential characteristics, evaluate the next level leadership behaviors. I always encourage leaders, because the first part is somewhat subjective, so the manager assessment, I encourage organizations to broaden their assessment usage. So, maybe it's assessing the top 2 or 3 levels of potential, whichever your organization is thoughtful about, because then it may bring in people that you weren't even thinking about. And again, if it's assessing capabilities that managers aren't really maybe thinking about effectively, then it may identify individuals that are generally going to be not thought about. The other thing is assessments are relatively cheap nowadays. Like you can do a personality inventory for $100, and it's that's not nothing, but it certainly is. It gives you the opportunity to engage with a broader group of individuals. And then align your assessment to the role, which means that if you're identifying individuals for the CEO job, your level of assessments need to be way more sophisticated. I'll give you an example. When I was at an organization, when we were doing assessments for our CEO potential role, we put them through day-long simulations and run by an outside organization. And they cost not insignificant amount of money. But if you're making a decision that is going to cost you $1 million or multi-millions of dollars based on the decision you make, $5,000 to $10,000 is a relatively small investment for the big impact that that decision could potentially make for your organization. And we've seen it in organizations that are out there that have made the wrong decision about a CEO, and it cost them, in terms of market cap, millions and millions and potentially billions of dollars. So making your assessment strategy aligned is important. Versus if you're doing a manager level, maybe you just do a personality inventory that has the right characteristics, because that's, making a poor decision there is relatively small in terms of its impact. Here's the example I was just talking about in terms of, we define the leadership characteristics that were going to be critically important, probably more characteristics than we needed, but it was for the CEO job. So we definitely wanted to make sure that we were assessing the right things. And we used the simulations, personality inventory, and an interview 360. So we did get feedback from their peers and internal teams. So we were able to use a lot of information to help us go deeper in terms of what the individual's characteristics and capabilities at the next level might look like. So we just talked the last 15 minutes about assessments that you would use to really assess potential. And those are important because you're making decisions about them. And so they need to be accurate. They need to have a lot of validity and reliability to them. I'm going to move now to how might you use assessment? How do you then bring assessments into something that is not as critical in terms of decision making, but is essential for building self-awareness? And that is part of leadership development. And so one of the things that, I don't know about you, but sometimes we get into high potential development and we think about the training that they need and maybe even some stretch assignments they need, which are really important. But oftentimes we forget what's necessary in terms of the self-awareness building that is critically important as people start making transitions from manager to director to vice president into the C-suite. And we know from the research that leaders are generally poor judges of their own capabilities. And so as you're thinking about development, the idea of helping them gain self-awareness through the use of assessments is critically important. And this is where I would say there are tools that are out there that are much better for development than they are for validating potential. Things like DISC, MVP, like the Myers-Briggs, great tools for development, not very good. They are actually not good tools when it comes to validating potential. They're not used in the right framework. So things like a 360, 360s are great for self-awareness. They help to really build an individual's view of how other people see them, which they should be aligned to the leadership capabilities that are identified in your specific model. And so again, creating alignment and creating language that just continues to self-perpetuate because you're talking about it and you're evaluating it over and over again. And then I think personality inventories, if you bring those two things together, you kind of have the what and the why. You have what people are saying about the leader and why are they maybe being viewed that way. So those two tools together are great. The great thing about 360s is if depending on the organization that you use, you can make them very, you can make up your own questions and your own competencies. Personality inventories, they tend to should hopefully align back to your capabilities or the capabilities you want out of your leaders. And so that's where self-awareness and assessments are so critical. So let me talk you through just a quick case study because I want to be able to have time to let you ask me questions. So this is a case study that of something I've been part of. The CEO is working with her CHRO to design the succession planning for a VP level positions. Here's how they built assessments into the process. So a couple things. The organization identified 5 indicators of potential. They asked the C-suite leaders to evaluate the potential of candidates. The leaders at the top 2 potential levels completed the Hogan personality inventory as well as a critical thinking assessment. And they reviewed for inconsistencies and gaps. So as you look at this, you're really looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, so here's the manager evaluation. They evaluate this individual as a high potential. There are 5 core characteristics: that strategic thinking, critical thinking, tolerance for ambiguity, drive for change, and team leadership. So the manager, as you can see, evaluated this individual incredibly highly on 4 of the 5 characteristics, as well as team leadership. They had a proficiency level. As you think about this, they also evaluated the individual as ready now. This person could go into the next level of leadership without any problems. Then we also then pulled up the assessment for this individual, and we found something that looked a little bit different. The assessment showed that the individual was developing in role as it related to strategic thinking. They did have one strength and tolerance for ambiguity, but the rest of them were just at a proficient level. And when we began talking to this leader in terms of their evaluation, we talked about the development area coming out of the assessments. We came to find out that the way in which the leader was thinking through strategic thinking was really not that aligned with the actual definition of the capability. They were thinking about it from the standpoint their assessment was execution related. They were able to take strategic thinking that others came back with, and they were able to execute it. And that is exactly what the profile showed, was that from the assessment that they were great executors. They couldn't come up with a lot of new ideas, but they could take other people's ideas and really make it happen. And this shows just the idea of validating the information. The manager, we couldn't say yes or no to their assessment of strategic thinking. But when we saw that there was misalignment in terms of what the assessment said and what the manager said, it enabled us to really think through how could they see this in a potentially different way. And it completely changed how the manager began to think about the capability that the individual had. Didn't mean that the individual wasn't going to be promoted someday. It was that there was definitely something we needed. They weren't ready now. They needed to have some more experiences and some more development in order to be able to take on those capabilities in the future. And I just make a couple final thoughts. One is obviously assessments are things that can be difficult for organizations to bring to the table, right? Managers often want their idea, like they want the power and the control to decide who's going to be promoted. And the way I've always talked about assessments in organizations I've been part of is that the assessments are not there to take away control from managers. It's really to help managers have more information. And being more informed will help you make better decisions. And if I can pull it all the way back to the beginning, is ultimately when you're talking about promotions and hiring for next level leaders, having as much information is so important. When you're talking about making $1 million decisions, it's so important to have as much information as possible. Very rarely would you see a leader actually make a decision to invest $1 million on a piece of inventory or a new machine that is necessary without doing their due diligence and doing the depth of analysis to make sure that, okay, yeah, we are making a good decision. There's a return on this investment. It's the same thing with this, that you are just playing the role of helping your organization do the right due diligence to make sure that you're promoting the right person so that the organization will be successful in the future. So that's kind of the key role that assessments play, and how you can leverage them in different situations. I'm going to open it up for questions here. I just end with, hey, in November, I'm going to do another webinar on how do you measure success of succession, and what does that look like? And then if this is kind of getting your attention, you have some interest in this, or somebody in your organization, early next year, I'm actually doing a 2-day workshop on how to create buy-in, design your program, and create tools and templates for succession planning. So if you have an interest in that. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. Feel free to take yourself off mute if you have any questions. You can certainly put them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. It was super clear. I can see that.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi, Katie.
Hi. So I might be thinking too in-depthly about this, but just thinking about like when you're aligning the success profile for a role within an organization, and then the assessment, like what do we do if like definitions don't match up? Like if we define strategic thinking as one thing, but then the assessment is defining it as something different, like how do we make sure that's aligned, or what do we do if they don't align?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple thought processes that I would encourage you to think about. One is, don't get married to only one assessment. So there may be a better assessment out there that could be better aligned to what you see strategic thinking being versus potentially what you're the way you've defined it. The other thing is, I think personally, if you can be thoughtful about is the right type of tool. So, for example, if you have strategic thinking that your is important, well, having them go through an actual simulation actually puts them through something that should be really aligned to the type of way you're defining that. A lot of times, unfortunately, we pigeonhole a tool because that is what we've been using in the organization, and I get that. A lot of times we struggle to get people to actually value using the assessment. So if they start using them, it becomes something that it's hard to take it away. And so if there's ways to kind of make small changes to your definition to align a little bit to the right tool, typically they're going to be okay from my experience.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, other questions? Okay, I don't want to belabor. I know everybody's got a busy Friday. If you ever need anything, if there's any way I can help you with any aspect of succession, or you just have a question about assessments, feel free to reach out to me. I will make sure everybody gets the recording, which has all the information in it. Otherwise, I want to wish everybody a great Friday, and I will hopefully see you again in a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.